Okay, so welcome back to the morning session. We now have a panel on Sell Fast or Grow Big, moderated by Chris O'Brien of the San Jose Mercury News. I'll pass it over to Chris.
Thank you, and I'm on. So yes, the panel is Sell Fast or Grow Big, and we're lucky because we have a great mix of folks here who can give a breadth of context to that question. At my far left over here is Michael Serta, who's currently VP of Technology at MySpace, and he's there because he sold his company a year ago, Threadbox, to MySpace. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. To his right, we have Dan Levin, who's Chief Operating Officer of Cloud Content Management at Boxnet. Dan's spent 27 years in the Valley and 20-plus years in startups. He sold 2 companies, and he says he sold one at the right time and one at the wrong time, and blew an opportunity to sell a third. So we'll get into that a little bit. And to my immediately left, Glenn Solomon of GGV Capital, who I'll let you talk a little bit about your current investments, but I know Pandora is one of them, and you've had 3 other IPOs from your portfolio. Is that correct?
While at GGV, I've had 3 other IPOs. That's right.
Okay, more than that overall, but
that's right.
3 at GGV. So let's start with you then, and that central question. You know, this is a hot time for this topic, I think, because of both the LinkedIn IPO, the Groupon filing. You know, lots of discussions about valuation. What are the opportunities there? But when you're looking at the companies in your portfolio, how are you addressing that question with them? And is there a single way to really address that question?
Well, yeah, as a venture firm, we, by definition, when we invest in a company, we are looking for companies that we think can grow very big. You know, our current fund is $600 million in size, which makes us a mid-sized firm certainly for Silicon Valley in terms of venture firms, and really globally these days. That's kind of a good solid median fund size. And so if you figure, you know, the average venture firm is going to own somewhere between maybe high-end 25, low-end 5% of a company, and you then do the math on how much of a return a venture fund needs in any one particular deal, one deal to make it worthwhile, then you know the outcomes start to need to be pretty large. That's the math of our business, and so when we look at companies, when we're evaluating potential investments, that's one of the main questions we ask. Is the opportunity large enough to build a very big company? Is the team in place that can go do that? And so you know, from the get-go, that's how we think about things. Now, I know that the topic of this panel is sell fast or go big. It's a very high-class problem to have that as a you know an entrepreneurial founding team to have that choice to make. And some of our companies ultimately then have that choice, and navigating through that is always, you know, an interesting conversation for everyone.
So Dan, let me throw it over to you then very quickly. I mean, if you can sort of sum up quickly your 3 experiences you mentioned here, and what you kind of learned from that along the lines of that question.
Yeah, I'm a framework kind of guy, so you know, my sense is there are 3 questions you have to ask yourself. Is it possible to grow big? Is there something that prevents you from growing big? And will the market allow you to grow big? My big takeaway is, so I sold one company pretty late in the game and passed up an opportunity to sell it that I should have taken. And my big learning there was, you know, you want to get the right spot on the trajectory. And then my most educational experience occurred in February of 2000 when I was in the room, not in one of these buildings, but nearby, when an executive from Microsoft said, under no circumstances will we pay more than $1 billion for this company. And we said, well, then I guess there's not much to talk about, is there? Now, we were on file at what we thought was going to be $1.5 billion plus valuation. So, you know, there were mitigating factors, but it turned out to be February of 2000, and after March 10th or whatever it was, there were no more IPOs. So timing is everything.
And as the man who sold the company then a year ago, how did you guys think about that question? How did you in particular think about that question at the moment? What were the trade-offs you saw going there, and what did you, obviously you agreed to the deal, or your investors agreed to the deal as well?
Yeah, so first off, let's be clear. Any entrepreneur that has an opportunity to think about whether to sell fast or grow big is really, really freaking lucky, right? I mean, because it's like 1% of entrepreneurs will have that problem. Let's be real. So not every time you get a shot at it do you get to ask yourself that question. Sometimes in my career I've been able to look at that and been able to go actually ask that question and make moves around it. Threadbox wasn't one of those. Threadbox was a situation where we started out as a social email service, sort of a group-based email service. And this was like right after, I guess we founded it Fall 08. You guys remember what happened in Fall 08, right? It was like, are we going to get money out of our ATMs even, at that point in time? So, so we took the thing to market, and actually we sort of nurtured the company along and figured out who our audience really was, and it turns out it was a small business collaboration product for small businesses. We ended up in your market, actually, and so it was like we were sitting there. I remember talking to our investors, and we're like, okay, we got 8 months of runway left. What do you guys want to do? We know what it costs to buy a customer now. We know what we can make off them over some period of time. We know we've got a great product. We've got great engagement. Do we invest more into this thing, or do we get out? With 8 months runway, asking this question in the board meeting, right? And they're like, well, let's look around the marketplace. There's been no exits in that space yet. Box hasn't exited. Zobdi hasn't exited. Yammer hasn't exited. The list goes on and on. Right. But that was the space we were in. But to your point earlier, you look at the market conditions, and that's how you make these decisions. And you go, okay, are we going to get in late and have to raise $40 million, and are we going to spend 4 years doing this to get to what we don't know yet? Right? So you ask all these questions. And at the end, we thought, you know what? We have opportunities to sell. There's folks that are interested, so let's pursue those and look at the best scenario we can, and then you make the best move at that time. And that's what we did.
So do you find then, the thing about working with entrepreneurs is, of course, if they're really good, you want people who are going to dream big. But at the same time, what we just heard described, I mean, how typical is it for you to be able to sit down with your companies and have a rational discussion like that with them, where you don't have a founder saying, no, we can be Facebook. I'm sure of it. I'm sure of it. We can be Twitter. Just give us another, $50 million and we'll get there.
Well, there's some subtleties here that I want to flesh out, Chris. So, I think if for those entrepreneurs in the audience thinking about who haven't yet raised professional venture money, who are considering doing so, I think an interesting way to look at one of the misunderstood elements of raising money from guys like us is that it's not all upside. And to be very clear, if you've started a company and you have very high hopes for it and you want to dream big, and you're pointing in a direction that's very far away and something you aspire to, and it's a very exciting outcome, and you're working hard getting there, and then somebody like Dan shows up and says, well, we want to take your company, we'd love to be part of the ride. In fact, we want to buy the company, and it's not a huge ultimate price tag, but it's life-changing for the entrepreneurs involved. That's a great situation to be in, and I totally agree with Michael. At that point, you are freaking lucky. And it's the hard work and coupled with foresight and luck that's gotten you to that point. And at that point, if you haven't raised any venture money, you have complete degrees of freedom to make that decision. And there are plenty of great entrepreneurs that have made the decision to say no to that offer and keep going. And there are plenty that have decided, for a life-changing event, I'm going to do this. I'm going to sell the business, and maybe I'll start another one someday. But once you take venture money, the equation changes some. And again, going back to what I mentioned earlier, when guys like us get involved, we are looking just mathematically, we're looking for bigger outcomes. And And so that is a subtle difference. And once that, so the decision to take venture money in a first round, a second round, a third round of venture capital ups the ante. Every time you take more money at a higher price, more money, more investors, as an entrepreneur, you're making you have a perhaps unwritten but a contract with your investors to try to make them money, and so you ratchet up what you need to do to go do that, which really removes degrees of freedom from your potential landscape of outcomes. And so to me, the decision to take venture or not is really important when you're thinking about preserving the right to go big or sell fast.
Yeah.
Well, Glenn, not to mention each subsequent round a company takes, they're further diluted, and they got to sell for that much more to make what they would have made, right? Not to mention that, let's say you're at your third round, is there really room for more investors? And how much do you have to grow to make room for more investors each time in the valuation, right? So there's all these dynamics coming along.
Don't forget liquidation preferences.
That's right.
Right. So Dan, let me put you on the spot then for a second. The time that he was selling Threadbox was very different than the market is now. I mean, it seems to be both M&A and IPO activity are picking up, so there's a shift. We still don't know how strong that current is, but it's certainly a different time than 2008. You guys are still privately held. So first off, I want to know, has that dynamic changed, been felt within the company in terms of how you guys think about this question right now?
Of course. I mean, as I said, there's sort of three factors, right? There's how are you doing? Is there some problem that you can see that maybe somebody else can't see? And there's what's going on in the market. When the market is heating up, when valuations are high, it's easier to raise money. Raising, capital constraint is one reason that you might decide to sell. And it also gives you a better sense of a future exit. So, Box, the thing that you don't understand when you're inside it is how unusual it is, right? So Box is one of these extremely uncommon companies. First of all, we have a global horizontal opportunity. Second of all, we have no dependencies. We don't need somebody else's channel distribution. We don't need somebody else's technology. We're freestanding. And third, we're riding a wave. This shift to the cloud is just this huge macroeconomic thing that's happening, and we're just sort of surfing along. And when you're in that situation, you have an entirely different problem, which is people want to throw very large amounts of money at you to buy the company. And now you're trying to say, okay, am I going to turn down some huge 9-figure offer in order to try to create the next billion-dollar-a-year company, when the statistics say there have only ever been 20 billion-dollar-a-year companies created in technology in Silicon Valley? Well,
which brings me to the other half of my question, which is, yesterday you probably followed Apple's announcement with iCloud. In general, that's the last decade we've seen a lot of consolidation, a lot of growth among, say, the 10 largest Valley companies, just becoming real juggernauts. And so here's a company that this has sort of been coming for a while, but made a pretty big announcement, I would think, that touches pretty broadly on your area. Again, is that a constant fear that one of the sort of biggies is going to come stampeding into your market?
Of course, and competition is always a risk. The Apple thing was actually great for us because it was really a consumer-oriented announcement, and so the SugarSyncs and Dropboxes and Amazons of the world now have to grapple with that, but we're very solidly in the business and enterprise space, and iCloud or documents in the cloud or whatever they call the thing is not a solution for some very large Fortune 500 company.
But that does create value for you guys because at the consumer level, all of a sudden people start to know what this cloud thing is, right?
Oh, yeah.
Right, so it starts to proliferate.
Yeah, I mean, slightly off topic, but this thing that's happening where you're getting cloud-based services pulled into the enterprise by the workforce, and then IT wakes up one day and says, oh my gosh, I've got 50 users of Box, what am I going to do? That's great for people who've got the features and the security and the administrative oversight that those enterprises want to see, because all these guys are out creating leads for us, basically.
But, at the same time, this goes back to something you were saying about taking many rounds of venture capital, and that ratchets up the expectation. When I was thinking about the Groupon thing, they touched off this huge debate about whether they're a huge success because they've suddenly, manage to generate hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue out of nothing in less than 2 years? Or are they a failure and unsustainable because they've taken all this money and therefore their valuation has to be, tens of billions of dollars for them to be labeled a success? I mean, has a company like that, in essence, sort of set the expectation bar too high that even though it's a success on some level, it might be deemed a failure because it failed to meet this huge threshold?
Well, Chris, you're a good setup man for a blog post I just wrote, which
I didn't know about.
On my blog, where Sand Hill Road meets Silicon Valley, or sorry, where Sand Hill Road meets Wall Street, and in it I talk a little bit about the Groupon situation because I think it's just fascinating. We're not an investor in Groupon, and so I read the S1 along with probably many in this room with some fascination. And so to address the point, you don't get to set the expectations of others. You have your own expectations that you can set, and you can try to manage the expectations of others. But the financial markets and the financial press will, in times when the market is going up, are going to ratchet up their own expectations and say lots of great things, and people will get very excited. Conversely, when the markets are tough, you won't get that extra benefit as a management team and a set of investors around a company, and things will be tougher. So you've got to think about that when you make your decision about whether or not to sell at any one point or keep going after the big vision. It's a rocky road to get to the big vision. Even the best companies, I would wholeheartedly agree with something that Dan mentioned. It's not just your opportunity, but it's sort of the environment around in which you play that is going to impact your path to getting there. The best entrepreneurs find ways to ultimately get there, but they go through ups and downs. And the point I make in the post is I compare Groupon, which I fundamentally think of as a consumer service, which has economics very similar to other online consumer services. It costs you money to go acquire a customer, and then you have some lifetime value of that customer over time. And how does that look? And I compare it to two companies that had very different outcomes. One, Netflix, which has had a monstrous run as a public company, but similarly went public as a high-growth, money-losing consumer service. And it went public at a time when there was less euphoria in the market, and so the investors around that company and the management team really had to stick with it, and it took many years, but now it is a darling and has a huge valuation, multi-billion-dollar valuation, contrasted with a company called Vonage, which was also a high-growth, high-money-losing online consumer service. And in that case, that company went public with a lot of fanfare and had more than 10 times the market value when it went public that Netflix did, but today has just a fraction of that value because it wasn't as successful. Now, which camp is Groupon going to fall into? I didn't bring my crystal ball today, sorry, but I will say that they're clearly going public at a time when there's a lot more euphoria. That makes it harder, I think, ultimately to reach the goal. But I'm not saying they won't reach it.
Yeah.
One thing I want to build on there is it's really important to sort out whose expectations you're solving for, right? So I think for most of us in this room, we're solving for either ourselves and our team, either economically or emotionally, or we're solving for our customers. An investor who invests money in my company at a fair market price has a right to set certain expectations with me, the unspoken contract, if you will, and I will certainly take those expectations into account. But at the end of the day, the guy who invested in $1 billion in Groupon was a professional investor, eyes open, making their own decision. I'm going to run my business the best I can, meeting the needs of all of my stakeholders, but I'm not going to allow that one investor's expectations to drive my definition of success.
So now I'll throw this up to any of you. I mean, one of the other amazing things about the Groupon story is how quickly it's going public. I mean, there's been a little bit of a conventional wisdom here that if you're going to go for the grow big opportunity, that's also going to be a long path. And it's been remarkable to see some of these companies like a Facebook sort of, hold fast private for so long compared to the previous area where you'd see these companies start and go public or get sold within months or within a year. Is that dynamic going to change? The speed at which these things happen? Is it feeling like things are starting to move faster? That the pressure is on now to make some kind of exit more quickly, or is the patience, I guess, of investors still there to sort of, if they think there's an opportunity to sort of wait, 5, 6, 7 years for some sort of resolution?
I think with Groupon, it's kind of an anomaly here because every other company that's going out right now, I mean, LinkedIn, they've been at it for years and years and years, right? It's not like they just started. And Groupon's the only example of like extreme froth, extreme opportunistic time, and it's being a public company is a very different deal, day to day. It's very, very difficult. I remember my first IPO I was involved in was my first job at a college called a company called Netopia, and I remember the CEO saying, "Well, we're going to do an IPO, and because we've had 6 consistent, up quarters." That's the old school. That's when you go public. It's like you got fundamentals you're building on.
Yeah. Up in profit, not up in revenue.
Right. You got it. Profit's key.
Yeah.
So,
I think you got to separate the two things. So, are businesses able to grow faster than they used to? Yes, in some cases, primarily because the impedance mismatch that was the channel of distribution has changed. Mm-hmm. So companies can now directly interact with their customers over the web at very large scale with very little investment, and that does change the pace at which you can grow a company. The question of liquidity is really a completely independent thing. So I think you see investors still have the same kind of time horizon, right? 6, 8, 9 years is pretty much the time horizon of most professional venture investors. But companies that don't benefit from being public companies may want to remain private to keep control, right? So for Box, being a public company would be a great thing because it would give us credibility with our larger enterprise customers, and it would give us a currency we could use to make acquisitions. But for many other companies, they want to retain control. They want the privacy of being a private company. And then their investors seek other outlets to liquidity through either a secondary placement of some kind or through some non-public market transaction. But I don't think that the investors are any more patient than they used to be. Their limiteds are still out there waiting for their money.
And they haven't seen it in quite some time, right? So,
in many cases, because there have been so few exits, that's right.
Yeah, I feel like I've got to jump in here.
Was it the LP and the money thing?
I'm largely going to agree that the time to build a company to achieve a real successful outcome has generically not really changed. If I look across the companies I've been lucky enough to be involved with that have had IPOs and or in process of going public, these are all businesses that had at least 8 years from founding to getting to that point. In some cases, more. So, I would agree. I think Groupon is an anomaly, and there have been some traditional distribution frictions that are in some models. Box, I think, is a good example that have been removed from the equation, and so some companies are growing very fast, and that attracts lots of capital. And what happens is in the public market investors tend to pattern match quite a bit. So if something works really well, the next company, even if it took a while to work, once it works and people get it, the next company that looks similar will be rewarded faster, typically. The reverse is true as well. If one company fails, then companies that look like it tend to be assumed, put in the penalty box, guilty until proven innocent, if you will. And so, there are times when the public market's more receptive to younger companies. But in general, the golden rule we stick to and we preach to all our management teams that are considering IPOs is, don't go public. The old school, I used to be an investment banker at Goldman Sachs, and yep, it was 30% growth and at least 2 quarters of profitability was sort of the standard pitch before a company could consider going public. I don't think that those are the right ways to think about it. I really think what matters more is, do you have visibility and predictability in your business? Because public investors, if you think VCs are bad, public investors cannot tolerate variability and surprise. So, you've got to really have lots of visibility and predictability in your business before you consider going public, point one. And point two, do you have a really big opportunity in front of you that you can grow into for many years? Because you got to consider it a long-term game. An IPO is just one step in the process. It is not an end game. It is one step in a long process.
Glenn, you're reminding me of something. So as part of the Sell Faster, Grow Big theme, I had a VC tell me one time that, because we were having a tough time, and it's like we're trying to figure out how to work through it and whatever, and he said, you know, Michael, every good company's got to have a near-death experience at least 3 times. I said, thank you, that really helps, you know. But that's another factor, right, in terms of whether because you got to deal with, we have to work together, and you got to tolerate the downs and the ups, and you got to find some flow there that yields some ability to work together and get things done and get to the other side. So often those dynamics, especially when the situations are trying, get difficult. Interests get slightly misaligned. Then all of a sudden it's like, well, you better sell quick because this guy's not going to backstop you at the next round, right? So.
Yeah. Well, we've been focusing kind of on the big part here for a second, but going the whole other direction, the other interesting dynamic I've seen, a lot of people have talked about the last year or two, is this sort of phenomenon of these sort of super early stage companies where it's just 3 or 4 guys get together and start a company, maybe bootstrap, maybe take a little bit of angel, and then get bought up by a Google or Facebook before they really even have much. I mean, there's sort of, there's different labels for it, but it almost seems like really they're just buying the team at a kind of hiring bonus. And certainly you have then these companies that are hyper competitive with a lot of money at the moment, particularly a Google, which has really ramped up its acquisition pace in the last, and that's been a combination of products and services, and in some cases it looks like just for the people. Is that another sort of bubble in the other direction in terms of is it possible for entrepreneurs to really even game that kind of dynamic, or is that just sort of dumb luck, serendipity with your idea and who you are?
I think they can game that. I think you can look at a given company's portfolio and see where there's crevices that you can build something in, and exploit that and say, oh, we're going to build this and sell to Google or whatever. But what they have to know at the same time is you end up at a place like Google, they want you there like 4 years as part of the deal, right? That's for an entrepreneur, that's a tough one, right? So, I think absolutely entrepreneurs are looking at that and being opportunistic about those things, and they're picking the companies they're aligning with. On the other hand, there are other companies that are in that category of like they're just killing it, and you're just like, wow, what are these guys going to do next? And I look at somebody like Instagram,
yeah,
and like they're like my current heroes. There's like 4 guys on the team.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Amazing.
That's amazing.
And they've taken, I think, about $7.5 million
right.
in Series A funding. They bootstrapped a little bit. They've only been out for 8 or 9 months at this point.
Their ramp and sort of growth of users adopting that service has been amazing. And of course, the argument against it is there's not a whole bunch of tech in the service. There's not a lot of barriers to that, but the barrier is becoming their user base. It's becoming the fashionable tool in its class.
See, but now that's a classic application or service where I think I can't believe someone hasn't come along to them and a Facebook or a Google and said, look, we'll give you $200 million or whatever crazy valuation they want to put on it to get the team, to get the technology and the users. I think must have some kind of value. I wonder if, of course, none of us know the inside story, but I have to bet they're fending off offers left and right at the moment.
I know, I just can't tell you. Not kidding.
The good incumbent companies, they don't have a problem with customer acquisition. So it's not like they need their 1.5 million users or whatever the number is right now. So it's definitely about the talent. It's definitely, is that incumbent company looking at building something in the photo sharing space that they don't have or whatever.
Right. Well, but just to stay from your viewpoint where you sit now, if you're looking at this sort of hot new service, isn't there also some sort of calculation of like, okay, we could build that, but it would take us X months, and then we're just competing against these guys anyways, and we've got to go out and do it and hire some people to do it. So isn't part of the calculation also, they've already done it, let's just get it in the house now and figure out how to plug it in later?
It depends on the company. So a lot of these companies have the NIH syndrome. You guys know what the NIH syndrome is? Not invented here. If it's not invented here, we don't want it. So there is a little of that at a lot of the incumbents still. It depends on how, the position of that company. I wouldn't see Google saying, gee, a photo sharing service is going to take us 2 months to build, so we better get these guys.
Yeah.
Right?
But I think just to add, I think another motivator we've seen in driving, to speed of outcome and also size of outcome is the presence of more than one, or perception that there's more than one potential buyer. And so if you are an entrepreneur building a company that fits in not just one crevice but a couple, and it gets perceived as strategic, that's when good things can happen as an entrepreneur, and maybe even so good that even if you've taken a round or two of venture capital, it can work even if you're still pretty young.
I think I'm a big one for categorizing things. The whole we're three guys and we're going to get bought for $30 million thing. First of all, it's only going to last for a little while, and second of all, I think people get stars in their eyes and they don't appreciate the importance of the first $1 or $500,000 or $2 million in your bank account. It's a totally life-changing thing to have $1 million in the bank. It's a house. I want to take 6 months and start something. And if I was particularly a very technically capable young person right now, I'd be thinking hard about trying to build something that was appetizing for a Facebook or a Google, because these guys are paying enough to change your life forever in exchange for 4 years of your time. There's another step up, which is what we're talking about here, which is that sort of first, wow, things are starting to really go spot. And that's really the hardest place to decide what to do, right? You're 20 people, the founders still own 40 or 50% of the company, your revenues are $1 million a year, but it looks like they might be $3 million or $4 million next year, and somebody comes in and says, hey, $75 million or $100 million, right? Enough that you have to pay attention, but not sort of your life's dream. That's, I think, the hardest decision for entrepreneurs to make.
Well, in that scenario, you can't discount the day-to-day impact it has on you emotionally and your family as well, if you have a family at that point. I mean, it's a big, big deal. It's a big consideration, because the moment you're not having to worry about where the next round is coming from or whatever dynamic there is, your life completely changes. You go from being up most of the night to being up, part of the night, I guess. But it's a very different dynamic. I'm facing that issue personally at some point. Everybody I know socially in the scene here thinks I'm going to start another company at some point in the next whenever, and it's like,
why would they think that?
Hey, but yes, but it's like my wife's like, really? Are you going to do this again? You know what I'm saying? It's like we've done like 7 companies now or something, right? Inside of 15 years.
So it'd be wrong to bet no on that question. That's what you're saying. Anything you want to tell us about?
No, certainly not. It's great to be here today. That's what I want to say.
For your current employer.
Yeah.
So any other thoughts then? I mean, I think that's a really intriguing point. I mean, you're right. Again, when you're really ramping up and seeing that huge growth, I mean, I think that's got to be the toughest point, because then everybody, you get a taste of it. You feel like, yes, I could be Facebook. I could be Twitter. I could be that. And yet often, my experience, especially with web-based companies, is that there's not a clear business model that's sort of been postponed. It's, like an Instagram again, it's sort of like, well, once we get 200 million users, surely we'll figure something out. And sometimes people do. I mean, and sometimes they don't, or it's unclear. Like in, I think, the case of Twitter, it's still an open question. So,
Chris, let me add something to the conversation here. I completely agree with Dan's analysis. There's sort of the $5 to $20 million kind of deal price range, and then there's this next step up, and usually that's coming after maybe some angel money's come in, and it's a harder decision to make, because at that point usually everybody around the table is more convinced, wow, we could really take this thing to the moon. But a new development that gets some headlines is that guys like us, we're slow and not all that smart, but eventually we figure out, hey, if we could convince that future rocket ship to keep going, we should do it and try to invest. And one of the ways to do that is to, at some point provide some liquidity for some of the folks for whom, $1 million in the bank would be life-changing. And you're seeing more and more firms, venture firms, adopt that sort of policy. And that's a change, because I've been in this business 15-plus years now, and that was heresy not even 10 years ago. But today, it's pretty common to see companies that are taking a B round of financing or C or D, where there's some liquidity. Now, it tends to be unhealthy when incentives get highly misaligned afterwards, but it actually, in my mind, can be an aligning moment if a founding team, which is critically important to the shoot for the moon outcome, and maybe young, maybe just does not have any means, can each take enough money off the table to then be able to, it's the house money, and it is the life-changing money, but it's not going to change the equation at work, where people are still very motivated and highly determined to go for it.
It can be extremely aligning when there's somebody like me whispering in their ear, saying, "Are you mad? Get some chips off the table." Somebody who's been around and seen the ups and downs. And you do get this misalignment where the venture firms have every reason to want to swing for the fences. And the entrepreneur who's 25, 26 years old maybe really would benefit from having $2 million in the bank. If you can take that off their mind, you can get them aligned onto this steeper trajectory.
Well, I was going to avoid this question because we could probably do a whole panel on secondary selling, but this brings me back around to Groupon. I mean, this is one of the, among the numerous criticism people have raised. I mean, they just raised almost $1 billion, and most of it went to cashing out a number of employees or providing liquidity for insiders to some degree. So then you do have this additional expectation because there's all these new shareholders who need to have a return, and then they file very quickly. And so, I hear what you're saying, and generally I've been in favor of that because it's allowed these companies to postpone it. But on the other hand, when I see that, and a company that clearly needs a lot of cash to keep its business just running from quarter to quarter, it raises the question: has that particular dynamic gone too far the other direction? Has there been too much cashing out or too much early liquidity?
Well, again, I think to focus on Groupon wouldn't do this conversation enough justice, because
and you're right. They're certainly not alone.
Michael mentioned it. This is a somewhat anomalistic situation, and it would be inappropriate for me to comment on the specifics there. I just don't know enough about it. But I will say that part of the calculus when we talk to an entrepreneurial team that says, look, we're interested in raising a round, we want to go big, but as part of it, we'd like to consider taking some money off the table. First question we ask is, how much, how big a stake, and I think we're not alone there, right? Guys like us are going to be thinking about, okay, can I thread the needle where I'm helping them solve a problem that they've got, which is the house money and the I don't have to lose all my sleep at night money, but can I also keep them super motivated and align our incentives where we both want to go for the same sort of outcome? And so that's the very typical conversation going on between entrepreneurs and VCs these days when this topic comes up.
Okay, so real quickly here at the end, if you're starting a new hypothetical company, are you thinking more purely about the idea at this point and what you can be done, or are you thinking about what is the opportunity I want to shoot for? If I'm going to start a company, does it need to be a gargantuan home run, or am I content doing something small and modestly ambitious?
Yeah, I think anytime you go after something, I think your best shot is to swing for the fences, because then you have options, right? If you're building for success, and big success, you have options for the smaller win success if you need to take that for some reason. So I think you got to think big at this point in time, and I think that the markets are conducive to that right now as well. Early stage financing is great. Still avoid it as long as you can. What's going on there?
Maybe that's our warning sign. But
are we talking about the wrong thing now? Is that what that means?
I'm betting that's someone's cell phone.
I thought that was in my head. Somebody playing that in my head. You guys hear that too?
I set that ringtone for
Don't
my
sell.
wife.
Don't sell.
I'm embarrassed. Sorry.
Yeah, I set that ringtone for my wife because she wouldn't answer the phone.
Time for one closing thought, Chris.
Yes.
You know, my father was a man of few words, but he used to say the occasional very interesting thing. And one thing he said was, it's just as easy to marry a rich woman as a poor one. And it really holds true in this conversation. You can only go big if you have a big opportunity. And it's no easier to build a company in a niche than it is to build a company that has a big opportunity. So for all the entrepreneurs in the audience, my one parting thought would be, if you aspire to go big, you better pick an opportunity that's got legs. I mean, I hope there's nobody next door who's building a card reader for the iPhone, for example. Really interesting little product, credit card swiper for the iPhone. Never going to be a public company, right? Interactive television. We could own the user interface through which everybody watches television. That's a big opportunity.
Okay. We'll wrap it up there. I want to thank all our panelists.
I didn't mean to have the last word.
That's okay.
I left a minute and a half.
Oh, okay. Well, does anyone want a last word? Everyone had that "I'm done" look, but go ahead.
I think this is it's a great topic, and if you know, my best advice to any entrepreneur starting a company along the lines of what Michael said is, yeah, do it. It's crazy and it's hard, and it'll take you in places you never expect it to go, and so don't do it unless you have a passion for it and are really ready to kind of go all the way, because otherwise the costs will be too high. Now, the fruits of the labor, to those who are lucky enough to achieve are so great that it fortunately entices lots of entrepreneurs to give it a try, and we just feel lucky that we get to work with folks like that. And if you want to attract venture money, that's really the way to do it, is to paint a very big picture, build a team that is dedicated to going for it. And if there's opportunities to sell along the way, then everybody has a rational conversation about it. But if you don't start with the grand vision, you'll never get there.
And you just have to do the math at the time. That's really what it comes down to. Factor in all those variables, line it up on the whiteboard. That's how you make your decision.
Great. All right. Well, I want to thank all our panelists. We hit it right on the mark, I think. And thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.
So please hold your seats. We have Gavin Newsom, the Lieutenant Governor of California, is getting mic'd up, and we'll be coming in shortly with